So there we go. Hello, comrades. Sorry for the slight delay, slight technical problems. Thanks for joining us. Tonight, in our series, Building a Communist Party, Past Attempts and Future Prospects, we want to continue looking at our past and what we can learn from our past and perhaps what we shouldn't repeat, ideally. Tonight, we're pleased to be joined by Mike Macnair of the Communist Party of Great Britain, who's looking at the Lassalleans, the Eisenachers, and the Gotha unification of 1975. Thank you, Mike, for joining us. Over to you.
Yes, 1875, not
Sorry.
1975.
Oh my God. Yes, 1875.
I have just sent to you, Tina, I'm afraid, apologies for lateness, which is also the cause of my lateness now, a handout, which is a timeline of the history of the Eisenachers, Lassalleans, and the Gotha unification. Where we have to begin with, I'm not going to speak to the timeline, but it's sort of, can we make it available to comrades in the chat or somehow? Uh, what I'm speaking to, in essence, is how did this come about? What's the background? And so on. And we start with the background is we start in 1863.
Mike, would you like me to share the screen?
That might work. It's not exactly a yeah, if that works, it's okay.
Yeah.
We start in 1863. German trade unionists have been attempting to get a campaign for the expansion of the suffrage together with the Liberals. But the Liberals proved to be totally unwilling to expand who can vote. But somebody among the Liberals suggests that they might try Ferdinand Lassalle, who is a leftist, activist, old-time associate of Marx and Engels in 1848, though not at all closely. Something of a celebrity lawyer for his defense of Countess Hatzfeld in her divorce proceedings. And Lassalle, in response to the trade unionists' inquiry, issues what's called the open letter. And the open letter is a longish pamphlet which argues that trade unionism is useless because the iron law of wages, the internal logic of capital, will inevitably produce wages falling to subsistence levels. And then in order for the working class to achieve anything of substance, what it has to do is a political action. But the political action which it needs to take consists in the first place, campaigning for universal suffrage, meaning universal male suffrage, manhood suffrage, the right of all men to vote. And in the second place, campaigning for state-backed cooperatives, which they argue state-backed cooperatives can make the difference, can abolish the wages system. And this open letter of Lassalle's in April 1863 is received with great enthusiasm, and in May, very quickly, the Allgemeine Deutsche Arbeiterverein, the ADAF, or Lassallean German General Workers Association, is formed. It's formed in Leipzig, not, I think, because they have vast forces in Leipzig, but because they think it's going to be more feasible to get the Saxon state to register a legal association than it is to get the Prussian state, because, of course, this is before the completion of German unification, and Saxony and Prussia are independent states. The Liberals respond to this by forming their own quote workers' organisation, which is committed to self-help and opposition to state aid, and not demanding the suffrage. And this is, moreover, unlike the ADAV, which is a individual membership organization, the Verein Deutscher Arbeitervereine, the Association of German Workers Associations, is a federal organization of local associations, and it is much bigger. So LaSalle, the ADAV, has hit about 5,000 in 1864. The VDAV, the VDAV has hit about 20,000 by that time. So October 1863, the ADAV recruits Wilhelm Liebknecht. He's another old 1848er. Quite a lot of the 48ers had gone off to the States and were involved in fighting the American Civil War, but Liebknecht had been in exile working with Marx and Engels, but not finding it very difficult to make a living, and went back to Germany on the basis of a promise of an amnesty, which seemed likely to have happened, though it's not quite clear what the situation is. But by spring 1864, Liebknecht is in opposition to LaSalle on two political grounds. One of which is that LaSalle has what's called the Kleindeutsch, this is German unification issue. Should you have a German unification round Prussia, which Prussia would inevitably completely dominate, is much the largest state in North Germany, or should you have what's called a Grossdeutsch unification, which would include both Prussia and Austria and all the intermediate small states, Bavaria, Saxony, Hesse, and so on and so forth. So LaSalle is in opposition Liebknecht begins an opposition to LaSalle, but this opposition is cut short because LaSalle is killed in a duel in August 1864. There's a brief moment where Liebknecht tries to nominate Marx as president of the ADAV, which he refuses to stand. Because he's busy with the First International, which is founded in September that year. December 1864, we get the appearance of Jean-Baptiste von Schweitzer's Der Sozialdemokrat newspaper. This is funded by another aristo. Schweitzer is a junior aristo who's been a playwright, an artistic type. He'd been involved in politics for some time, but got busted for picking up a teenager in a cruising area in a public park, and that sort of knocked him on the head. But LaSalle brought him back in. Liebknecht is suspicious of LaSalle's relations with Bismarck, and it turns out rightly, because in reality, LaSalle had discussed with Bismarck the possibility of the monarchy using the socialists as a weapon against the liberals to defend the monarchy against liberal constitutionalism. And Schweitzer, in fact, took money via a Bismarck funded this aristo, who in turn funded Schweitzer, to continue to defend the policy of LaSalle of allying the workers' movement with the monarchy against the liberals. And the consequence of that is that by spring 1875, the Social Democrat is openly supporting Bismarck and Prussian-led Germany. Liebknecht resigns from the editorial board. Marx and Engels, who had agreed to be notionally on the editorial board, resign, and Prussian government then demonstrating its the usefulness in its view of Schweitzer to it has Liebknecht arrested and deported from Prussia, and he goes first to Hamburg and then to Leipzig in Saxony. And going to Leipzig in Saxony, he meets up with August Bebel, and they work within the VDAV, the Liberals Trade Union Confederation, and actually they push the Liberals Trade Union Confederation towards taking up political demands. In fact, they win the position of the suffrage. And they are also involved in the creation of a left liberal party in Saxony called the Deutsche Volkspartei, the German People's Party. And so we've got this very weird situation where there are two groups, both of which are sort of vaguely connected with Marxist ideas. They're vaguely connected with Marxist ideas in the sense that both groups argue for universal suffrage. Both groups argue for independent political representation of the working class. But on the one hand, the ADAV argues for independent political representation of the working class, but takes money from the monarchical state and regards the working class as having a political alliance with the monarchy against the liberals. And on the other hand, the Bebel-Liebknecht group is working, in fact, within a left, doing entry in a left liberal party. And in the left liberal parties associated trade unions, and is so neither of them look very Marxist in that sense. They look somewhat Marxist, but they don't look very Marxist. Yeah. And in fact, all the way through between 1864 and 1872, Marx and Engels' correspondence shows that they were sort of had, let's call it, fairly ambiguous relations with both sides. They weren't prepared to back Liebknecht and Bebel unequivocally. They equally weren't prepared to wholly break with Schweitzer and the ADAV. 1866, we come on to the Austro-Prussian War, which is AKA War of German Unification, though that's not quite accurate. It's actually a war about Schleswig-Holstein in North Germany, South Denmark. And Liebknecht is carrying on an anti-war agitation in summer 1866, while Schweitzer, who is really having been jailed for seditious libel, is released from jail on health grounds. And then Bismarck pays for the revival of Schweitzer's Der Sozialdemokrat newspaper, and the Sozialdemokrat campaigns for Prussian victory in the Austro-Prussian War. On the other hand, the Liebknecht and Bebel form a congress of anti-Prussian leftists, which advocates for a sort of mixture of the Lassallean position of cooperatives on the one hand and the position of a variety of democratic demands, liberal democratic demands, which the Lassalleans hadn't been particularly keen on promoting. Which is quite sharply criticized by Marx and Engels. This is Chemnitz's platform of 1866. 1867, Bebel is elected to the Reichstag, the Parliament of the North German Confederation. Schweitzer is actually elected president of the ADAV, which is quite small at that time, and at the same time adds internationalism and political democracy into its platform, which sort of brings it closer to Marx and Engels. And Sophie von Hatzfeld and others split to form the quote Lassallean Adav, Ladav. Um, Liebknecht is elected to the Reichstag. Schweitzer is elected to the Reichstag. So you've got these guys actually in Parliament. 1868, Liebknecht starts a newspaper, and then Der Sozialdemokrat, the Schweizer's paper, gives very favourable, long, multi-part, favourable review of Marx's Capital, and Marx and Engels comment on Schweitzer's review that it's actually a good um, project. And we get then in July a private agreement between Liebknecht and Schweitzer that both the ADAV and the VDAV will join the First International. This is on the road to fusion. So the question of fusion between the ADAV and the VDAV is beginning to be is beginning to be posed already in 1868, though it takes till 1875 until it actually comes off. Yeah. But the effect of the in September when they put this to the VDAV Congress, there was a split, and Schweitzer suddenly backs off from unity and denounces the VDAV and says that it adopts the anti-international faction's position. Quite why Schweizer's doing that, not entirely clear. It may be that it is actually the case he's still dependent on funding from Bismarck. Mm. And in 1869 at the ADAV Congress, Liebknecht and Bebel are allowed to speak, and Schweitzer calls for a vote of confidence, which passes, but the Congress, but with a large minority abstaining. But then in June, Schweitzer suddenly announces we're going to reunify with Hatzfeld. We're going to return to Lassallean organization principles, abolish the powers of the elected leadership committee, and just have powers vested exclusively in the president. And yes/no referendum on this, 5 days to reply. And Wilhelm Bracker, who is actually quite famous for Marx having written to him about the Gotha program, and others denounce Schweitzer's scheme and call for a congress at Eisenach. So the Eisenach Congress in August 1869 founds the Social Democratic Workers' Party, SDAP, and the Eisenach Congress, then it's interesting and significant point that the Eisenach Congress is already a unification Congress, because it's a unification between Bebel and Liebknecht and their supporters who had been in the VDAV and the German People's Party, and the opposition to Schweitzer in the ADAV. Now, all of these organizations are quite small, but on the other hand, they have actually, under the regime which Bismarck had created for the purely advisory parliament of the North German Confederation, they have actually got representatives in the parliament. And 1869, 1870, on the one hand, we get Liebknecht makes a much more decisive break with the Liberals in the German People's Party. On the other hand, July, we get the Franco-Prussian War. And in the Franco-Prussian War, at once we get a sharp differentiation between the ADAV and at least Liebknecht and Bebel as the MPs for the SDAP. The reason being because Liebknecht and Bebel are anti-war, continue to be anti-war, just as Liebknecht had been anti-war in Russian War in 1866. So Liebknecht and Bebel are anti-war in 1870. They don't vote against war credits; they abstain on war credits. It gives rise to a sharp debate within the SDAP because the executive says this is a German war of defense against French aggression, which was also Marx and Engels' view. But then the course of the war, extraordinarily rapidly, the French are smashed. The Germans move to annex Alsace-Lorraine. It turns and even the EC denounces, the executive denounces a shift to the war of conquest. In fact, this is disastrous in terms of the immediate membership of the SDAP because the whole executive committee is arrested. Then Babel and Liebknecht are arrested. They've been held off being arrested because they're parliament deputies. And SDAP membership is not quite halved, but substantially reduced. 1871, the Reichstag elections, both Liebknecht and Schweitzer lose their seats, but Babel does manage to remain elected. The result is again that Schweitzer then resigns decisively as ADAF president. He's not going to come back. In the summer, autumn of 1871, the split in the First International is consummated. The London Congress of the International is denounced by the Bakuninists and the ADAV. And on the other hand, the Bakuninist conference in Switzerland is supported by the ADAV. 1872, this also affects it, is Babel and Liebknecht are convicted of treason by campaigning for a republic and sentenced to 2 years jail. Which knocks them out, not completely because they are able to smuggle stuff out of jail. But it's certainly the case. We can see that in August, the SDAP Congress calls for unity with the ADAV, prohibits Volksstaat polemics against them. And there's to and fro polemics around the unity question between roughly autumn 1872 and November 1874. I should say, although this is not absolutely material to it, that Schweitzer's financial dealings with Bismarck and questionable operations in relation to the ADAV's finances are exposed after his resignation as president and so on. 1874, everything shifts, and it's in spite of the ADAV Congress having said you can't have unity in May 1873, January 1874, in the Reichstag elections, they agree to give each other second preferences, and there's a big rise in the votes for both parties. And in the same period, ADAV and SDAP supporters start to combine in trade unions. So instead of having, because we had ADAV controlled trade unions and other trade unions, which the SDAP people were involved in. And then there's a faction fight in the ADAV, which results in both sides in the ADAV faction fight approaching the SDAP to seek unity. And that then develops extremely rapidly. November 21st, they announce a common Reichstag fraction. By January 1875, Liebknecht is saying we're definitely going for unity. And May is the Gotha Congress. Now, going back to, I've just gone in a very, very summary way through the history. The effect of the Gotha Congress is a absolutely classic snowball effect. That we start with quite small numbers. The ADAV is a little bit above 12,000. The SDAP is substantially less. But the result of the unification is very rapid takeoff. And the resulting SAP, Socialist Workers' Party of Germany, is rapidly become so big that the government illegalizes it in the hope of suppressing it, but doesn't go to the point of banning anybody who's in any way associated with the SAP as standing in elections. So the SAP then, having grown very rapidly before the ban, is able to carry on the basis that they publish newspaper out of Switzerland and smuggle it into Germany, and otherwise they don't have formal party organization. They have what are called Vertrauensmänner, trusted men who do the to form the link between the external editorial board in Switzerland and the constituency organizations, because they're allowed to organize at constituency level, but at no other level other than constituency level. So the party then works between the Fraktion, the deputies in the Reichstag, the editorial board in Switzerland, the Vertrauensmänner are linking the constituencies to Switzerland, and constituency organizations. And uh, on the basis of this form of illegal organization, which frankly Lenin is trying to create in the argument in What is to be Done, is an argument for a SDP style, SDP under illegality style of organization. We wind up with the situation that finally the government gives in and legalizes the socialists in 1890. I haven't gone anything like that. I've gone up to the Gotha Congress. The Gotha Congress isn't by any means the only case where unification produces a snowball effect. The same is true of the unification of the German of the Austrian groups in the 1889, of the unification of the Italian groups in the 1890s, of the unification of the French groups in the early 1900s. In every case, the creation of unity results in a radical, explosive growth of the unified organization. Marx and Engels were very critical of the Gotha unification. And the reason why they were very critical of the Gotha unification was because they thought that the Gotha program, or at least the draft of the Gotha program, gave far too much in the way of concessions to the Lassalleans. I would say, on the other hand, that although certainly are concessions to the Lassalleans in the text of the Gotha program, some of them are reduced. That Lars Lee has shown that some of the concessions were actually reduced in the version of the Gotha program which was passed. But it's also the case that in between the Lassalleans and the Eisenachers, there were two fundamental differences. One of which was, well, I have to say that the concessions to Lassalle in the Gotha program, quite a lot of them are already there in the Eisenach program. So unsurprisingly, because actually the Eisenach program was already a program of unification between Bebel and Liebknecht's group and a substantial group coming out of the ADAV. So that there is concessions to the Lassallean dogmas, but it's not concessions to the Lassallean dogmas. It's concessions to the Lassallean dogmas, which in reality Liebknecht had already been making in 1869, rather than Liebknecht writing a purely Marxist program in 1869 and the same. I have to add also, in relation to Marx and Engels, secondly, Marx and Engels' opposition, that the context of it is partly the fight which is ongoing in the First International, or rather in the split in the First International between the Marxists on the one hand and the Bakuninists on the other, because the Bakuninists argued that it was class betrayal to pursue democratic demands, that the fundamental task that any democratic revolution, Bakunin argues this in response to the Eisenach program, that any democratic revolution without the social revolution having happened first in the form of the general strike would inevitably be merely a bourgeois revolution. And the Lassalleans don't quite have the same line as Bakunin, because the Lassalleans are not advocates of the general strike policy, but they are advocates of the idea that the revolution has to take place on social grounds and not political grounds. And hence the point, what we have to get is universal suffrage is the only political element. But once we've got universal suffrage, what we have to fight for is only state-supported cooperatives. And it's only state-supported cooperatives which will allow the escape from the iron law of wages and the wages system. I add, in spite of their opposition to trade unions, the result of the 1869 split in the Lassalleans, which led to the creation of the Eisenach Party, was also that the other side, Schweitzer and his co-thinkers, created a whole load of trade unions. The difference essentially is that the trade unions which the Eisenach people were involved in were multi-tendency trade unions. The Lassallean trade unions had two characteristics, one of which was that they were Lassallean trade unions in political solidarity with the ADAV, and the other was that just as the president of the ADAV had dictatorial powers, so the president of the ADAV was automatically the president of all the ADAV trade unions. So that one of the things which is part of the process of the split of 1869, but is also part of the process which happened afterwards, is that the trade unionists have a tendency to sort of splinter off in the direction of the Eisenachers. Okay. So then 1875 and the Gotha program, yes, there are individual concessions, particularly in the context of what we would call the maximum program to the Lassalleans in terms of general theory. But at the same time, it is actually a politics first. It is actually a politics first platform, like Marx's politics first platforms in the demands of the Communist Party in Germany, and the politics first platform of Chartism, and the politics first platform of the party program of the Parti Ouvrier, and so on and so forth. So the Lassalleans had not conceded all the stuff about the iron law of wages or the importance of cooperatives, but they had in fact conceded substantially on the question of maximum minimum program and politics first party, rather than a party which the Lassalleans had continued to be a party founded on agreement to Lassalle's open letter as a piece of general theory. Secondly, in relation to the organization question, the Lassalleans capitulated completely. Rather than having an organization with individual members who elected a president who had absolute and dictatorial powers over everything, which was the Lassallean position, which had been sort of half backed away from in 1869, but then got back through Schweitzer's reunification with Hatzfeld. They accept the Eisenachers' principles of organization, which involved having a party executive and a separate editorial board of the newspaper, and the local organizations all having their own right to organize, raise funds, publish, and so on and so forth, rather than having any direct single person monarchical form Um, it was important to Lassalle, the monarchical form. He regards he argues in his correspondence with Bismarck that the proletariat has a natural tendency towards monarchism and the single leader, and that's how he presented what was going on. He passed the leadership of the Adav after his death. Put it in his will who was going to take over from him as the next president of the Adav. Um, and Schweitzer similarly, when uh, uh, an advocate of the First International was involved in the ADAV in 1867-68, Schweitzer argued that Waldteich was a decentralizer because he wanted to take away the dictatorial powers of the centre and go for the collective leadership model, which was that, in essence, the International Workers' Association was characterized by collective leadership model. So back to the question of unification. It's important to be clear, in spite of the fact that the Lassalleans and the Eisenachers were on opposite sides in relation to Germany's wars of unification, because the Lassalleans were loyalist in relation to the German state. But by 1875, the Lassalleans had practically abandoned that policy as well. Um, but it's also the case, it's not the case that this is like the unification, the First International with the Marx and Co. and the Proudhonists and the British trade unionists, quite a lot of whom were liberals and some were Comtean positivists and other such tendencies of one sort and another. Um, and also attempting it from 1869 to unsuccessfully attempting to include the Bakuninists, which they then wound up fighting over. Um, the This is a unification of two groups, both of which are substantially influenced by Marxist political economy, because Lassalle, although he didn't get it all right, was very substantially influenced by Marxist political economy, both of which are advocates of the central task is to fight for universal suffrage and for political democracy. But the Lassalleans, it's just universal suffrage, and then we go to co-ops. For the Marxists, it's universal suffrage and a whole load of other democratic demands, and at the same time, then also a bunch of minimum program economic and social demands. So it's not a unification. It's not a broad front, the whole workers' movement unification, which in a sense actually um, Liebknecht and Babel had attempted with the VDAV and which wasn't their initiative, it was the Liberals' initiative, but the Deutsche Volkspartei, which was a left liberal party, which was intended to be a party of the whole movement, and in that sense, parallel to the First International, but on a national scale. 1870, the Liebknechters abandoned that project and gone over to, no, we have to actually construct a socialist party. And the unification then is not a unification on the most minimum possible basis. It involves less concessions than Marx and Engels thought were being made in 1875. But the flip side of it is the trigger, the creation of unity creates a snowball effect. And we have actually seen that more recently, the creation of unity in Brazil of Trotskyist groups together with Christian socialists in the trade union movement creates in the Brazilian Workers' Party a snowball effect. Of course, it's a waste of time because it just creates at the end of the day, a waste of time because it just creates a big reformist party, the Workers' Party of Brazil. Rifondazione, the hardline splinter of the old Italian Communist Party, opens its doors to the Trotskyists and Maoists, and again for a moment, there's a snowball. For a few years, there's a snowball effect, and Rifondazione rises to around 100,000 members and lively, not enormous electoral support, but very lively political life. But then at the end of the day, they're sucked into joining government coalition, and by being sucked into the joining government coalition, they're blown up and destroyed, and what remains is virtually nothing. Similarly, Scottish Socialist Party, okay, much, much, much smaller. But if we look at what happened when the Scottish militant Labour opened its doors and let the Trots in, Scottish Socialist Party became significantly, albeit as minority, electorally successful, significantly regrouping not the whole of the Scots left, but a lot of the Scots left. So that in that sense, it's the principle of unity in itself. But of course, the SSP similarly, in the case of the SSP, the problem in essence is that they go for bourgeois electoral tactics of building a cult of the personality of Tommy Sheridan, and then when that at the same time places them in an impossible conflict with their attachment to the politics of bourgeois feminism, which then blows up in the form of the Sheridan scandal, and the SSP is destroyed and wiped out. And, neither faction out of it amounts to anything. So yes, unification, but unification, on the one hand, unification in itself is radically on the road to something very substantially larger. On the other hand, the Gotha unification is not a unification between groups which are utterly opposed. It's not unification between reformists and revolutionaries on a broad front platform. It is a unification between revolutionaries, albeit ones who had quite sharply different politics in the period between 1863 and 1875. So I'll finish there.
Thank you very much, comrade. Very interesting look at this hugely important history, part of our history, working class history. Comrades, if you have a question or a comment, please click raise hand. I've got a few questions for you, if that's okay, to get the ball rolling as well. I mean, you've kind of in the end, you touched on why unification can be a very positive step forward if you're not that far apart politically anyway, and that Marx and Engels perhaps made more of the differences than there actually were, and were more critical because they were criticizing Bakunin at the same time by hitting out at the Lassalleans. In Lassalle's method of organization and his politics, I think they still actually have a sort of ripple effect today. And I've read, and perhaps that's wrong, perhaps you can correct that, but that actually Lassalle and his party was the first party that actually had a membership structure that said we need to form a permanent organization, although it fought only for one thing, as you explained, universal suffrage. It was the first organization worldwide to institute dues, for example, that you have to become a member and you pay, and then that makes it quite different in it to what went before. It was quite a networky kind of situation where Mark Mulholland looked at it last week. That we organized in networks rather than in a party. That was the first proper party, and that's certainly a useful thing that we've learned from Lassalle's way of organizing. On the other hand, you did describe the sort of the labor monarch idea. He was a dictator in his own organization, and he did these deals, which only came out, I think, in the 1920s, late 1920s. This relationship he had with Bismarck. I think they met 4 or 5 times, had letters exchanged, etc. That only came out in the late 1920s, and Lassalle never openly said so. But as you described, he had this idea that the state could be used for the good of people. He had a totally different understanding of the role of the state, and I think that's still reflected today, actually, amongst much of the left, the state as a sort of a neutral arbiter, between classes. We can, if we just appeal to the state to help us out, it seems clear that people need better living conditions. And if we just go nicey and ask for justice and ask for peace, everybody should be able to understand that, rather than seeing the state of, an instrument in the hands of those of the ruling class, an instrument against it. I think Lassalle and he has that in common. I think when you read, for example, the program of Peace and Justice campaign, the program of Collective. It's all about, asking for justice. Who's going to mete out this justice? It's supposed to be coming from this lovely neutral state, and I think they have that still in common and have not made that step away from Lassalle's misunderstanding. Do you think it comes from a misunderstanding or a different definition of the state, or is there something different going on? And yes, do you think that there's positives from Lassalle that we can look at today?
Am I taking questions one time or
Yeah,
so?
please, if you could.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay, one time. First off, LaSalle and membership organisation. I agree that the membership organisation thing is a big step forward. Yeah. Why I don't think that LaSalle that it came to be an individual membership organisation because of the brilliance of Ferdinand Lassalle coming up with the idea of having an individual membership organisation. It comes to be an individual membership organisation for two reasons. The first of which is because it's proposed to organise, it starts with the invitation to Lassalle from trade unionists. So the idea of an individual member, a trade union is already an individual membership organisation with dues. So the idea of doing a political party like that is undoubtedly an innovation. You're quite correct, and Mark is correct. The way in which political parties were organised from when the first modern political parties emerge around 1678 to 1683 in England, the Whigs, so-called, because they were accused of being Scots Protestant rebels, and the Tories, so-called, because they were accused of being Irish Catholic rebels. So both these are terms of abuse. But the nature of the party was you had a parliamentary fraction, and then you had local clubs and associations in the constituencies. And you had national clubs for instance, the Kit Kat Club was a Whig club. I've been to a meeting a few weeks back at the Reform Club, which was the Liberal Party's London club. But there are also clubs and societies in the localities. And the mechanisms of this is a wonderful mechanism for organizing the capitalist class, because the national clubs and associations and the parliamentary fraction organises corruption at a national level, and the local clubs and associations organise corruption, bribery and corruption at a local level. Um, and that, but the Chartists were creating, and indeed the pre-Chartist movements were creating just that sort of movement, but just with a different politics. The Chartism, we've got a general appeal, and then we've got clubs and banquets in the localities and events of that sort. And so creating a party on the trade union model is an innovation of the Lassalleans, but it's not an innovation of their conscious innovation of the Lassalleans. It's a result from that it comes from the trade unions. And it also comes from the actual organization laws of Prussia, that it was in order to get a legal organization, you had to have an individual membership organization based in Leipzig in Saxony. So there's no problem with people in Prussia. It would be illegal for people in Prussia to organize a political party in Prussia. There's nothing wrong with people in Prussia signing up as individuals to a political party in Saxony. Or thought to be nothing wrong with it. so that it's
Don't get
one
you
of those
over
things where
my
it comes
hand.
up by serendipity. Yeah. Um, Second, the state is a neutral arbiter. I don't think Lassalle thought the state was a neutral arbiter. What he thought was that the working class can ally with the feudal aristocracy against the bourgeoisie. So he's allying with Bismarck, not as Bismarck represents the state, but as Bismarck represents the Junkers and the monarchy. Thought the working class can make because the main enemy, the insistence of the Lassalleans, the main enemy is the capitalist class. And therefore, because the main enemy is the capitalist class, we have to ally with the monarchy and the aristocrats against it. You've got some sort of support for that in sense in that the 10-Hour Day Act in England was passed by Tory votes in 1847 as revenge against the Liberals over the abolition of agricultural subsidy. So you're going to screw us over agriculture. You Liberals are going to screw the aristocrats about free trade in corn and abolishing the corn laws. We'll screw you by giving the working class a 10-hour day. So maybe, and actually Engels suggests that in the 1880s, he says that it would be acceptable for the socialists to call for a Tory vote as long as they did so clearly and explicitly to punish the liberals for not delivering. Liberals say they'll do something, they promise, they don't deliver. The workers' movement should call for a Tory vote in order to just to punish the liberals. Moshe has made this point actually. As long as you absolutely exclude the possibility of voting for the Tories, you allow the liberals to triangulate and say, okay, make all sorts of promises, but always move to the right. Yeah. They have to be there has to be circumstances in which they're going to lose the election as a result of the intervention of the working class. Okay, so that, but Lassalle makes it into an absolute principle. He might have backed off from that if he hadn't died when he did. We don't know. Um, Schweitzer, it does seem to me, was actually financially dependent on Bismarck. It seems to me that Lassalle wasn't financially dependent on Bismarck, but he was playing political footsie with Bismarck. Schweitzer seems to have actually been financially dependent on Bismarck to keep his paper coming out. Um, that's it.
Sorry, what do you mean by financially dependent? He actually paid the bills for this, or was it just that he didn't
Yeah, from the
censor?
outset. It wasn't, it was indirect. Bismarck put state money into a German aristocrat, and the German aristocrat then paid the bills for Schweitzer's paper. That
Okay.
was already the case when Marx and Engels were signed up to it in 1864. But then they broke with him because they thought he's just pushing Bismarck's line.
Mm.
Um, and it was already the case that there was suspicion about Schweitzer's dealings with Bismarck from a very early stage. Though the guy I've got at the bottom of the handout, this guy who blames it all on Marx and Engels is homophobia because um, uh, Schweitzer, in fact, denied throughout his life the story. He said it was a stitch up, his being convicted of picking up a teenager in a public park. And it's quite possible that it actually was a stitch up. We don't know that, but this guy, uh, um, American author, blames Marx and Engels' opposition to Schweitzer on homophobia, which is sort of Marx and Engels' homophobia is public record, no problem. But it seems to me clear that actually Marx and Engels' opposition to Schweitzer is not about his homosexuality. If he was a homosexual, it's about his playing footsie with his taking funds from Bismarck. And indeed, after he resigned as ADAF leader, the ADAF conducted an internal organization into his finances, and it was some of the financial stuff was exposed.
Mm. In terms of then the unification itself, just the last question before on the floor. I mean, this is considering that we're in a fusion period as well, and very much a situation, a period in flux. I mean, the dates you gave, I mean, this dragged on for years, didn't it, before it got together to the Gotha Progress and Congress. And you described, and just briefly in your overview there, the SAPD prohibited polemics against the other side while the other side kept hitting back or attacking. Could you describe those tendency a little bit and how the it was clearly a painful fusion, or for some painful that dragged on for some time. But clearly, I mean, the outcome a few years later, obviously, the foundation of the SPD was clearly a huge success for the working class internationally up to a degree. I mean, it was the first mass working class party, etc. Do you think it came at too much of a cost? Was that program that unification too unprincipled, or was it that the outcome of the SPD being quite such a success, and
Well,
spiraling? Was that worth it?
yeah, as far as the SPD is concerned, I know that it's widespread belief that the weaknesses of the SPD are, at the end of the day, written into the Gotha program. I don't think that's actually right. And the reason why I don't think that's right is if we ask who was the leader of the revisionists, the pro-imperialist revisionist tendency in the SPD. You know, we've got in the first place Bernstein. Bernstein was Engels' literary executor. Bernstein was the senior Marxist figure, yeah, in this fight. Bernstein was the guy who Marx and Engels put up to be the Marxist polemicist, as opposed to Kautsky, who became the sort of central figure, but was a much more. He's a bit of a who the fuck is this guy? He's basically a Czech nationalist who's found his way into the socialist movement. But it's Bernstein who develops the revisionist theory. And secondly, Eugen von Vollmar. Vollmar was a mass strike advocate. Um, and he was a mass strike advocate in the 1880s and advocate of wrote a book called Das isolierte sozialistische Staat, which is the isolated socialist state, which is the first book to advocate socialism in one country, on the grounds that if you insisted on an international revolution, as Marx and Engels were insisting on an international revolution, the result is you will never take power, because you have to be willing to take power in a single country, and then that means you have to be willing to do socialist construction in a single country. But Vollmar, mass strike advocate, 1891, his El Dorado speeches, which is from his El Dorado hotel where he made these speeches, we have to go into coalition with the liberals. So he is exactly like the same trajectory as Paul Mason. He starts out as a radical mass strikeist, and then radical mass strikeist isn't going there. He becomes a advocate of coalition reformism. Okay, if it were the case that it was the guys who were Lassalleans in the 1860s who were becoming the leaders of the right wing in the social SPD, then it would be plausible to say that it's the failure to confront their positions in the Gotha program which accounts for the backwardness of the SPD. But given that it's people who had been unambiguously on the Marxist side, or in Vollmar's case, people who are influenced by Bakunin, who wind up going over and becoming the leaders of the reformist tendency. Leave aside the fact, the other side of it, the collapse of the SPD is extraordinarily quick. In summer 1914, the SPD leadership, together with the left wing of the trade union leadership, is planning a general strike for universal suffrage in Prussia. They hadn't supported Luxembourg's argument that in 1910, 1911 they should accelerate the demonstrations against suffrage and turn them into the general strike. But they were prepared to go for the general strike. And then what happens is that the Reich government launches the First World War. Yeah. And we know from, I'm trying to remember the guy's name, the history of the First World War, the Prime Minister goes to meet the trade union leaders. And he says to the trade union leaders, if you procure the SPD to vote for the war credits, we will. It's not only the case, it's absolutely essential for national defense because the Russians are coming. But also, if you procure the SPD to vote for war credits, we will give you full legalization of the trade unions and a whole series of other economic concessions once the war's over. So this meeting between Bethmann Hollweg and the trade union leaders is the moment at which the trade union leaders then afterwards take control of the SPD and push through the vote for war credits, push through the backing for the quote social peace unquote. It's not, it's not that the SPD has long, gradual, very visible decay and so on and so forth. The SPD, it's still the case that SPD editors are all being locked up and accused of lèse-majesté and all of that right way through. 1914 is decisive shift. It's not just decisive shift. There's an element of the left. Parvus, Hainisch, Cuno, Lensch. They're all leaders of the radical left in the SPD, and they become advocates of German victory on the ground that the main obstacle to progress is the British Empire. And the same is true, of course, in Italy. The pro-war pro-war group in Italy is led by Benito Mussolini, who was a leader of the radical syndicalist mass strike left in the Italian Socialist Party. Guesde was a hardline Marxist, opposed to Jaurès, and it was Jaurès who was assassinated on the grounds of his pacifistic hostility to the war in the run-up to 1914. Guesde backed the French war effort. So it's just in the sense of it's. I don't think the standard far left version, according to which the Gotha program is original sin of the SPD, works. That's
Thanks.
it.
One question I have to pick you up on: Marx and Engels were homophobes. I have to.
Yeah.
Not heard that one. Can you briefly explain that? Sorry.
Well, you can look at that article about the queer, which I put on the handout. The queer Marx and Engels love to hate is online, and it's got a whole load of stuff from Marx and Engels unpublished correspondence about dug up. But it's also the case that Engels' Origin of the Family contains very explicit homophobic comment about ancient Greece. Yeah. I'm not sort of totally, I'm not going to say that the ancient Greek thing of adult men, quote, initiating 12 and 13-year-old boys is desirable model of sexuality or anything like that. But the Marx Engels response to it and response to Ulrich's arguments, third sex arguments in Germany, is unambiguously. I don't like the word homophobia in general. Actually, I don't think it's terribly useful. It's I think I've written about this. But they're hostile to homosexuality. Let's call it that.
Okay, I'll bring in comrades from the floor now. Ian.
Oh, hello. Yes. Good evening, comrades. I just wanted to ask about the critique of the Gotha program. To what extent is it really taken on a life of its own outside of the context, partly because of Marx is talking about a transition from a sort of a lower phase to a higher phase of communism, and how that differs from Lenin's discussion of that kind of movement. And to what extent is the critique of the Gotha program still useful as a text for understanding the formation of parties?
Do you want to answer that straight away, or do you want to ask?
Oh, yeah, okay, CGP. I think there's lots of useful stuff in Critique of the Gotha program. At the same time, I actually think there's, say, for example, the stuff about labour tokens. It seems to me, actually, this is Marx writing at high speed, because this is Marx writing at high speed to make a last-minute intervention in the negotiations around the Gotha program. Yeah. And what he writes about labour tokens is not really defensible, because when he says the analysis of it's labour tokens is an Owenite nostrum, which would get rid of money. And the point about labour tokens is you receive labour tokens, you can spend them only on consumer goods. And there's a problem with this already. Is I buy a electric screwdriver. Yeah, that's consumer goods. But suppose that my pension was gone and I had to set up in business doing small scale carpentry work. Then my electric screwdriver would at once become means, having been bought as a consumer good, would become means of production. Yeah. The scheme which about labour tokens, which is in CGP, is actually inconsistent with the general scheme of Marxist analysis of political economy and critique of political economy and capital. And it's the reason why it is simply because this is a very high speed writing off to polemicize against the concessions to the Lassalleans. And in the same way, actually, parts of that critique of the Gotha program, the comments on the democratic demands being just the demands of the liberals, is plagiarized from Bakunin. This is Bakunin's critique of the Eisenach program, which the Eisenach program 1869, Bakunin's critique. We haven't got a definite hard date on it, but almost certainly 1870. And it relates to it's the same way we've got an oddball, the Marx's letter to Zasulich. And Marx's letter to Zasulich, of course, is a series of drafts of a letter to Zasulich which was never sent. But then the Stalinists dug it up as being an argument for socialist construction bypassing capitalist stage in Russia. Yeah. But Marx's letter to Zasulich is also informed by the context of the polemic with the Bakuninists. Because Marx's line in relation to the Russian groups was that he was for Narodная Volia because they were politics first people, and against black redistribution of Plekhanov and others because they were politics second, they were economics first, politics second people. And that affects how he writes. So yeah, I think Critique of the Gotha program, it's got some really interesting stuff in it. But at the same time, it's not a straightforwardly, this is a document on the basis of which you can found fundamental principles.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, and please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, all good.
Great. Okay. I've never actually spoken to any one of you. I've just been following a few of your recent YouTube offerings. I found it very, very interesting. Obviously, you seem to be open to discussion with people who regard themselves as communists. So I thought I'd make a tiny little, I don't know, contribution maybe. Personally, I'm a great fan and sympathizer of an organisation which I don't know if you're even aware of. It's the Communist Workers' Organisation. I don't know if you know of that organisation at all.
US Maoist group?
No, not at all, not at all. British affiliate of the internationalist communist tendency. I think our main historic roots probably go back to the Italian communist left.
Oh right, yeah.
Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. Yeah, one of the points that I've read in your draft program. Yeah, so the draft program of the Communist Party of Great Britain. Okay, and again, I'm no expert. I'm not very aware of you. Yeah, but I noticed that in that draft program, you go into great depth on many topics. Really, it's quite a hefty program, isn't it? And yet, as regards what I think is the maybe a principal question, you have very little to say, and I've actually, I pursued it a little bit, and I actually came across a work by a Mr. Mike Macnair. Yeah, and I read it, and I think, I can't remember the exact title of the work, but you cover this question, and the question is that of workers' councils. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And as far as I could, the organisation that I personally sympathise with, we see the workers' councils as being primary. How does the working class come to power? Through the workers' councils. We see that in the critique of the Gotha programme, chapter 4, I believe. Marx talks about the dictatorship of the proletariat. Yeah, which okay, to a modern ear might sound a little bit, a little bit scary, the dictatorship. But what does it mean? It just means the rule of the proletariat. How does the working class come to power? And we think that was answered by the workers' councils. We do not believe that the working class gives its power to a party. So we do not believe in party dictatorship or party rule of any sort. Now, when we talk about the rule of the workers' councils, yes, the party is involved in that. So the party members can be involved in the higher organs of the workers' councils, but that is not the same as party rule. Okay.
This is slightly off topic. I've let you go on. It's not really the topic of tonight's.
I just want to, because I've read,
it's an interesting one. So I'll ask Mike to reply briefly though on it, if that's okay. Yeah.
I say you seem to have very little to say. In you mention it, but it seems to be almost like the workers' councils are not the vehicle for proletarian rule.
This is not a CPGB meeting, so Mike is a member of the CPGB.
I would like to ask Mike, because I've read his work, so okay. And the man's here,
I gotcha. Okay.
Does he see the workers' councils as being something which is obsolete, an anachronism, something which is gone, or
okay, we got you.
Is there a rule for
okay.
councils today?
Okay. Is that okay? It's okay, Mike. If you could reply briefly.
Yeah, very briefly. I'm for the revival of trades councils, any forms of coordination, job stewards combines, job stewards committees, factory councils, local councils, one sort or another. But flip side of it, the Soviets in Russia were set up by the Mensheviks in 1904 in imitation of the British trades councils. And 1905, sorry, in imitation of the British trades councils. And in 1917, they were set up by the Mensheviks and the liberals because they played an important role in 1904, and because the Mensheviks and the liberals believed that the workers' councils could mobilize support for the war. And indeed, right down to the failure of the June offensive, the workers' councils did mobilise support for the war. Yeah. And it's a point which is made by, in fact, by Leon Trotsky, and I think correctly, in look at Germany. Germany's created workers' councils, yeah, but because the SPD majority was still the large majority party of the working class, it was the SPD majority dominated the workers' councils and led the workers' councils to support the creation of the Weimar Republic. The same's true in Austria. The workers took the factories, set up councils, went to the leadership of the SBO, SB Austria, and said, we control all the factories. We need a central planning organisation to enable us to run the factory, keep supplying the factories so that they're actually running. And the SBO leadership says, give them back to the bosses. And give them back to the bosses, because if we don't give them back to the bosses, the Italians will invade. Well, actually, what that tells us is the uselessness of revolution in a single country assessment, because if the Italians had attempted to invade Austria in 1919, the Italian army would have broken up because Italy was about to enter into a revolutionary crisis. So it's thinking of the revolution as being a single national process, as being a series of national processes, actually prevents you from making revolution. But the flip side of it, actually, no. Workers' councils doesn't solve the problem. The problem of the party involves us displacing and getting rid of. And it involves also equally, dear me, dictatorship of the proletariat. Mark Mulholland wrote an excellent pair of articles in the Weekly Worker a couple of years ago, and he makes the example of dictatorship proletariat means stuff like the Irish land wars and stuff like the intimidation of MPs into voting to get rid of the slave trade in 1807. Or for that matter, my ex-comrade, back when I was working in the Cowley car plant, before my time actually, but he was prevailed upon by the union leadership to call people out on strike when they didn't want to go out on strike. And they chased him around the plant with a rope, with a noose, until he abandoned it. And that, it seems to me, it's I'm not going to go further into that because it's relationship with Gotha and the critique of Gotha is very marginal, but it's much more a question of a judgment. When I was at Trot, we attempted creating workers' councils as a policy in Portugal in 74, 76. It didn't work. The Chilean left attempted the policy of creating workers' councils in Chile in 73. It didn't succeed in defeating the army. At the end of the day, in order to actually have a revolutionary crisis, you have to have a split in the armed forces, and that requires a general political understanding of the old regime is corrupt and has to go, which is so widespread that it actually reaches into the armed forces. And it's not that the party then should take over. I don't agree with the idea that the dictatorship of the proletariat is the dictatorship of the party. That's wrong. But it's that you actually need the political party to do the work of undermining the legitimacy of the capitalist state under capitalism. It's not the party, job is not to coordinate the strike actions. It's not to give direction to strike actions or anything like that. It's to do the political work of delegitimizing the judiciary and delegitimizing the bribe-taking MPs and delegitimizing the advertising funded press and so on and so forth. That's it.
Thanks both. Peter, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okie doke. Thanks, Mike. Mike, what would you say, you just before when you were talking then, it seemed to me that you're reducing notions of Soviets, conflating with workers' councils, and that leads, so in other words, treating it as if it was economistic. And I don't think like the Soviets were just workers' councils. I don't think the Paris Commune were just workers' councils. There was something more political and social and economic as well. So, there was a confluence of class forces within the commune, and there certainly was within the Soviets. I'm just a bit puzzled about like where you stand then with Soviets, communes, call them what you like, and party politics. The politics of the state. Do you see the Communist Party's job just in terms of propaganda, and then we see what organisations the working class develop spontaneously, and then we work to kind of like raise the consciousness politically by a critique of capitalism, a critique of the state in its current strengths and weaknesses, and where it can be changed in the interest of the working class. Or do you see the party as maybe taking up some of the bigger politics at state level and entering parliament? Do you think that's the role of the party? And I suppose that base what I'm asking is, where do we see the working class developing a political consciousness? Is it just, it seems to me that the working class develop a political consciousness wherever they work and wherever they live. And, so there's got to be some sort of dialectical approach between the use of parliament and the coming together at a more local level, a community level of working class people on a collective level. And I don't know, I'm just confused, because I had a question, and Ian, I think, answered or raised the question. Part of it anyway. I'll just have a look now. Right, it seems to have gone. Did you take it away, Tina? Yeah, okay. Doesn't matter.
No, I didn't.
No. It's all right. It was just about that, really, about, when Marx was writing his critique of the Gotha program, did he not have in his mind what happened 4 years earlier with the Paris Commune, and what he wrote about that, and what he, when he was reflecting on that, the experience of that, and as much as that, maybe he thought, the direction of communist politics, of the left politics, were erring too much towards the state and the seizure of the state. And another concern that I think Marx probably had was that this fitted in with the time, with the development of capitalism, where capital had become more social and more collective. And also the labour movement itself had become more collective, and labour as a kind of presence within production was more social and collective. So we have this like a development in society which facilitated state supervision, if you like, and state administration. And I think possibly Marx, might have had that as a kind of a warning sign, that we take up arms at state level and build castles in the air about making it more democratic, and we slip into bourgeois territory where the bourgeoisie, as it develops as a class, as it develops the economy and the wealth that's produced as value, but wealth anyway, can be used to reform away working class demands. And so, they're my kind of fears, and also what I mentioned before about I'm just puzzled as to where you stand.
couple of big questions there.
Yeah. Soviets and workers' councils. The question essentially is: do the forms of organisation of the working class, which the working class uses as fighting organisations under capitalism, provide the basis for a conception of an alternative state? Yeah. And that's a mistaken idea. And in fact, it's part of why the Russian Soviets failed, because precisely what we get is the Russian Soviet Constitution of 1918, still 1918, yeah, but also leading immediately afterwards. It's like the constitutions of a trade union or a political party. That is to say that the Congress only meets once a year for a few days. The Congress of Soviets meets once a year for a few days. It elects an executive committee which meets quarterly. And the executive committee, the ministers are responsible to the presidium of the executive committee. That's exactly the same setup as the constitution of the union I used to be a member of, Transport and General Workers Union, or for that matter of the Labour Party, or for that matter of the Socialist Workers Party. And precisely because the Supreme Soviet is not a standing body, it's not like a parliament which meets every day during parliamentary term, it can't control the government. Doesn't matter how much it wants to control the government, isn't capable of controlling the government in the same way as the National Committee of neither the conference of the SWP nor the National Committee of the SWP can control the Central Committee of the SWP, because you can't come back. Parliament, we don't do it anymore because the democratic element of the British Constitution has been reduced and reduced and reduced. But when Parliament was actually a governing body, the minister comes and gives a non-answer, and the committee says, "Okay, go down," and the tipstaffs come and take him down to jail and you stay in jail until you're willing to give us a straight yes or no, a clear answer. You know, that you can't do that without a standing body. Okay, so you need a standing committee to which the government is answerable and which can sack the government. Mm-hmm. And that marks this point. I've actually just in this week's paper which is just out, got a review of Bruno Leipold's book, Citizen Marx, about the political republicanism of Marx's ideas, and the fact that the political republicanism of Marx's ideas continues all the way down to and including the Paris Commune. And it includes sort of quite precise, we reject referendums. We reject directly elected presidencies, because these are anti-democratic, anti-republican constitutional measures. Yeah, so yes, we need to create bodies which we need to promote and create all sorts of forms of broad working class organization. But creating the sorts of forms of broad working class organization doesn't solve the problem of political power. And it doesn't solve the problem of political power, both because the forms of working class organization, insofar as they're defined by working class struggle under capitalism, are adapted to conditions where you aren't actually in charge. And because as I said about Germany and Austria and so on and so forth, the creation of workers' councils leaves intact the mass workers' parties. And so you create lots of cordones were created in Chile, but the Chilean Socialist Party and Chilean Communist Party remained dominant. Councils were created in Portugal in 74, 76, but the Socialist Party and the Communist Party remained dominant. Councils were created absolutely generally and including the army in Austria and in Germany in 1918-19, but the SPD and the SPO remained dominant. Yeah, we need the party the party question is not posed in order to create a Soviet-style regime where the party is in charge. It's posed in order to defeat the existing regimes where any new creation will be redominated and reconstructed by. And we see it equally in the Corbyn movement. You know, masses of kids go into the Labour Party. Okay, a lot of them with the idea of just collectivism is going to be enough, but also a lot of them going in and hoping that they can do something. I got asked for advice by my own daughters, who admittedly are now in their 40s, but were going into the Labour Party as effectively political virgins. These guys going into Labour Party as political virgins to fight the Corbyn movement, but the existing Labour left around John Landsman and around Campaign for Labour Party Democracy and so on and so forth, steers them, and indeed the Trotskyist left around people like Graham, ex-Trotskyist, self-identified Trotskyists like Graham Bash and co, steers them into the broad front policy, and that steers them into giving backing to Corbyn, and that steers the Corbyn guys, they're clinging to unity with the right wing of the Labour Party. Yeah, but it just as much it doesn't. The fact that that's in the Labour Party makes absolutely no difference if you were talking about something happening in the trade unions, something happening in mass strike movements, and so on and so forth. So it's Ian's got this. Revolution will throw up novel forms of working class power. Yes, but it's still the case. The difference is the Bolshevik revolution and this is the fundamental error of the modern far left. Yeah? The Bolsheviks were the majority party of the working class already in February. They became demajorityized, like the Portuguese Communist Party, who were the majority party of the working class at the outbreak of the revolution. The right wing recruited much more rapidly than them, but they were the majority in 1912. They were the majority in 1914. And it's that fact that they were the majority and that they were an organization with tens of thousands of militants in the spread out over the country, which enabled them actually to do what they did to get to the extent. But then, of course, they fall into the trap of thinking that because they were the majority of the working class, this is my judgment for what it's worth, is Brest-Litovsk, the German army points a gun at their head. They have to surrender. It's unavoidable. There has to be a surrender at Brest-Litovsk. But they make that into a theory that because they're the guys, in spite of the fact that they're a minority, there is no majority in the country for surrendering to the Germans in Brest-Litovsk. They say, therefore, the country has to be ruled by the advanced minority. And that's what they say in Second and Third Congress of Comintern. The state has to be, the dictatorship of the proletariat has to be the dictatorship of the minority party. That's an abandonment of the fundamental principles on which Marx argued in his work on the Paris Commune, in everything which he wrote previously, and so on and so forth. It's not the doing the emergency action. It's quite often people have to do emergency actions which are unpopular and so on and so forth. That's the nature of emergencies. It's the making the emergency action into a theory of a general theory of proletarian rule. Okay, that's me. Sorry, I don't want to go on further.
I'm going to briefly bring in Moshe because he's wants to say something on this subject. I have to admit defeat. We've got onto the council's question, so let's discuss it. Moshe.
Yes, well, excuse me for intervening in this. I've written an essay about form of organization in a worker state. People don't realize that while an organization on a country level, based on councils, seems to be a form of direct democracy. It is the most indirect form of rule possible, because people in the council meet each other and can decide directly on local matters. But when it comes to running a nation or an international level economy, then what happens is that local councils elect a delegate to a higher level council, and the higher level, let's say a regional council, elect a representative to still higher and maybe on international level. So you need 3 or 4 grades of organization in a sort of pyramid, and the grassroots people in the individual council have the most remote way of controlling what is happening on the state level or national level. I don't want to go in detail about it, but a lot has been written about it. And while council-based organization is very suitable for dealing with local matters, it is very unsuitable for dealing with matters on a higher national, let alone international level. It's a very indirect form of democracy, very remote from the grassroots.
Thanks, Moshe. Interesting point. Okay, I'm going to go back to some of the speakers who had their hands up for a while, and I suspect they didn't want to talk about councils, but who knows? Sachin, I think your camera doesn't work, does it? If it does, please switch it on.
It's not working at the minute, but can you hear me clearly?
Yep.
Yeah, just really briefly, like one of the things that you were talking about was dates. So thank you for putting up the things and the period. One of the things with the period I recognized was the period covered also encompasses a great development of the establishment of the Austro-Hungarian state, but also of the German Empire. So in terms of the national question, the general question, but if you've got any specific points, because of course within each of these empires also existed lots and lots of different nationalities. So, you know, from the beginning of the period, I think it was about 1863-ish to about the establishment of the Gotha program, which changed a lot. I just wanted to know what the thoughts were generally about nationalities, the national question, and then, of course, imagine a completely different lineage of history in terms of lots of like Germanic people or Germans, or because the question of nationality is just about solid now, you know, with the United Nations got charters on this, but it was a period of flux. So what were their thoughts? And then of course, you know, like Prussia, for example, there were Polish majorities, etc. So I just wanted to open that up because I found a lot of it was very centered on German, like what became the German Empire, as opposed to what the socialists were doing or the communists were doing, and how things could have been different. But yeah, so it's open. It's not a specific thought.
Thank you. Mike, I suggest I take a couple more at this point. Anthony, please. So you're muted.
Muted.
I want to ask a question on the relationship between free trade and protectionism between Bismarck and the National Liberals and Conservatives, and how that impacted on the working class movement in terms of trade and other concessions they had to make, because that was important with the anti-socialist laws.
Thanks, comrade. I've got Steve Freeman. Do you want to answer these, Mike, or shall I bring Steve in?
I think we've had Moshe, Sachin, and Anthony.
Yeah.
Let's have Steve, and then I'll come back after Steve, if that's okay.
Yeah, great. Steve.
Hi, Mike, and thanks for your talk and explanation. And I want to focus on something that Tina mentioned a little bit earlier, which I think is quite important. So I think here we have in this kind of Lassallean policy the origins of what I might call social monarchy or red monarchy. I think Marx used the term red monarchy. Now you could say, first of all, social monarchy is the policy of Bismarck. That is to say, to keep the constitutional monarchy, however limited it was, the German Kaiser, and add state capital, post office, railways, and things of that type, and welfare measures, pensions, and other such things. And that is the social monarchy. So it's a policy of the ruling class to incorporate the working class into the state. Now that's different from social monarchism, with an ISM on the end of it, like these other isms, which is an ideology adopted by the socialist movement. And what this means is that socialists are advocating reforms to improve as it were, the lot of the working class, but within the political and constitutional framework of the constitutional monarchy. So I call that social monarchism. And so the minimum, if you like to put it another way, the minimum program is not a Republican program. It doesn't have the idea of a democratic republic because it wants to work within the given framework of the state. Now, the relevance of that to today, and this is why it's an important period, of course, is that you could certainly say that the Socialist Labour Party, the Socialist Alliance, Respect, Left Unity, Tusk, and the Corbyn movement all had illusions in the constitutional monarchy. They didn't promote a program that was in any sense democratic republican in its politics. So they didn't adopt what I would call a minimum program, a minimum republican program. And if that wasn't bad enough, which was terrible, disastrous, because it showed the whole movement was compromised, which is, in my mind, one of the reasons why all these attempts at broad parties failed, but that the communists, the Republican communists, failed to challenge this in any serious way, kind of adapted themselves to it instead of challenging it. So I think that we have a responsibility for the failure of those organizations for never challenging the programmatic basis. We kind of accepted it and sort of said, all we need to do is Socialist Alliance, become the Communist Party, tell them to become the Communist Party, and then it'll all work out fine. And of course it didn't. So I think we have to be able to mount a challenge, and we can learn from this period in history, Mike, in the way that you've explained it to us as well. I think the lessons for today, as Tina mentioned right at the very beginning, when Tina herself drew this connection between then and now. So that is my kind of, is it a contribution? Call it what you like. Question. I don't know if it's a question. I don't know if it's a contribution, but whatever it is, that's it.
It was something. Thank you, Steve. Pam's got a hand up. Do you want to take her, Mike, and then perhaps sum up everything, or do you want to answer now?
Well, where are we in terms of absolute time?
Well, we've got 15 minutes left.
Let's hear what Pam has to say, and then I'll come back in at whoever and anybody else, and then I'll come back in for 10 minutes at the end.
All right. Thanks, comrade. Hi, Pam.
Thanks. It's just a question to Moshe or anyone. I'm sympathetic to what he says about the pyramidal structure of democracy. What is the alternative? And Moshe referred to his essay, and could he please give us a reference to it? Thank you.
As you might have seen, he's put his essay in the chat, so comrades can read that later. Thanks, Moshe, and thanks, Pam. Okay, Mike, over to you. Some wide-ranging discussion, to put it mildly.
Yeah. Okay, and then we've got Ant also has a comment in the chat. And Steve Lee had a comment in the chat about the Bolsheviks as well. Moshe and pyramidal hierarchy, I think is basically correct. It's the design of the Soviet Constitution of 1918. You do get direct delegation from the city Soviets to the Supreme Soviet, but in the countryside, the peasantry, the voting is extraordinarily diluted because it's you get a village Soviet, and then that delegates to an Oblast Soviet, and then the Oblast Soviet delegates to a province Soviet, and then the province Soviet delegates to the Supreme Soviet, and that's a regime. And I think probably it's almost certainly the same setup applies in relation to the formal constitution of the Chinese People's Republic. And this is a form of voting which, as Moshe has argued, actually radically dilutes votes. Yeah, in that sense, it's what we've done is we've wound up with, because essentially Karl Kautsky redefined democracy to mean the policy of the Entente powers and the nature of the British and American states. That's in 1917, 1918. Yeah. And Lenin and Trotsky responded to that by making the Soviets into a principle. But then no other revolution has been able to make the Soviets working into a principle. And Trotsky identified the point both in Lessons of October in 1923 and in 1931, writing to on the Spanish questions. You can't create unity of an organizational form which represents the whole working class unless the far right wing of the movement is willing to go in with you. Yeah. We didn't create the Soviets, said Trotsky. The Mensheviks created the Soviets. And after the experience of 1917, it was already the case that the German SPD insisted that officers had to be represented in the soldiers' Soviets, which altered the character of the soldiers' Soviets fairly obviously. But it's too late. That was a sort of, it's a bit like a few years back the Prison Officers Association took the government by surprise, mounted a stunning action of an illegal strike, which the government, the troops were in Iraq, so this is 10, 20 years ago, the troops were in Iraq, the prison officers went on strike, the government was forced to capitulate. But once they get taken by surprise once like that. In the same way, the mobilization using social media in the Arab Spring, the governments were taken by surprise once, and once they've been taken by surprise once, they find out how to deal with it afterwards. Okay, so that's arising out of Moshe's stuff. Sachin, the development of this is the moment. This is happening at the moment of the Industrial Revolution in Germany and in Austria, and the working class as a class the urban working class as a class is radically expanding. Yeah. It's not just a matter that the state, to Steve, that the state wants to incorporate the working class. It's also that the first phases of the Industrial Revolution involve enormous ill health among workers. And the Prussian state in the under Bismarck is led to introduce welfare measures by the problem of how the hell are we going to have soldiers who are healthy enough to fight? We need to have welfare measures in order to have soldiers who are healthy enough to fight. And the British state does the same thing. 1914 suddenly realized, Jesus Christ, the working class is really unhealthy. And the only way we can deal with the working class being too unhealthy to fight is to introduce some strong social welfare measures, including sports in schools and sport fields, which of course they've been this country has been getting rid of for the last 30-40 years. Strong efforts to improve diet, reduction in the rent share by rent control from 1915 until 1985, all of which is about it's about having an effective army. Steve Lee, the Bolsheviks didn't have a majority in the Soviets. I agree, the Bolsheviks didn't have a majority in the Soviets. My point is that going into the revolution, as of 1912, the Bolsheviks won all the working class constituencies. If we had a Trotskyist organization which was going to go into a revolution in circumstance where it had won all the major working class constituencies, but the Labour Party still won places like this town, Oxford, or the outer suburbs of London, or etc., 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 we would be in a rather very different place to the place where we are now. And it's the point is that the Bolshevik Party goes into the revolution as the majority party of the working class, loses its majority because the radicalization flows primarily into the Menshevik Party, and wins its majority back over the course of summer, autumn 1917. It also, at the same time, the anti-war wing of the Mensheviks paralyzes the pro-war wing of the Mensheviks, and the anti-war wing of the social revolutionaries, the left social revolutionaries, win a majority. And the Bolshevik Revolution is made in October, is made by a coalition between the Bolsheviks, the left social revolutionaries, and the anarchists and other left parties. There's Alexander Rabinovich's list. There's about a dozen different left parties of one sort and another, all of which wind up getting incorporated in the Bolsheviks. Antony's free trade and protectionism. This is the same point as Sachin. We're in the midst of the German Industrial Revolution. Now, it's a common thing to say we can't do what the Germans did because we aren't in the midst of an industrial revolution and the first growth of the proletariat. But actually, if we think about the Industrial Revolution and the first growth of the British proletariat, the political expression of that was the various radical movements of the late 18th, early 19th century and Chartism. And Chartism was smashed in 1848. And then there's a small revival in the 1860s around the suffrage campaign and the skilled trade unions. They're talking about total organized numbers, about 60,000, something like that, joining the First International. That revival is enough to induce the capitalists to make concessions in 1867 on the suffrage and in 1871-75 on legalizing trade unions. That gives back we get an American style regime in which the trade unions back the Liberal Party. But then the left, by organizing in a more, the SDF and the ILP begin to win local elections. They're not winning parliamentary elections. They're winning local elections. Winning local elections, again, it's enough to create sufficient leverage to induce the trade union right to create the Labour Party in 1900. This is the trade union right, the Fabians bringing in the socialist groups in order to combat the socialist groups. And the Labour Party, from the outset, it's a party of the it's what Steve calls the social monarchist party, but it's also a social imperialist party. It's the agreement that Liberals stand down to allow Labour MPs to be elected in 1906, and the Labour MPs have a free vote on social questions, but they vote with the Liberals on the war questions and imperial questions and the military budget. So the point is simply it's not the fact that the left grows explosively in post 1875 does not have to be just about the fact that it's in the midst of the growth of the German working class. It's simply that the interest of the working class in unity is so powerful that unification tends to create a snowball effect. But of course, the British left is committed to, it's not just a question that the Labour, that the Socialist Alliance was determined to pretend to be left Labourites. It was also that the Socialist Party pulled out of the Socialist Alliance and displayed the Socialist Alliance to be just another of the groups. And in the same way, and then the SWP pulled out of the Socialist Alliance and shut it down. And then the Socialist Party, in order to show that respect is just one of the groups, set up the campaign for a new Workers' Party, and then Tusk, then No to EU and Tusk, etc., etc., etc. So that this is a pattern of the organised far left deliberately sabotaging unity initiatives, which in fact we've got from our period in the 1860s. We've actually got Lassalle, not Lassalle, but Schweitzer, on more than one occasion, deliberately sabotaging unity initiatives before his losing and so on and so forth. Steve, I don't think that the Communist Party failed to challenge the anti-republicanism of the Socialist Alliance and and respect, and he left unity. On the contrary, we challenged it in the only way in which we could challenge it, which was by fighting within the organisation and putting up resolutions to commit it to republicanism and to commit and fighting round issues of political democracy, not just within the organisation but nationally. There is, without it's what Steve wants is that we should pick out the issue of republicanism, but pick out the issue of republicanism in a very narrow sense of republicanism, and pose that, and not pose the questions of internationalism, and not pose the questions of anti-war, which are the issues which divide. The communists are divided from social democrats round the issues of war and internationalism, and round the issues of republicanism and constitutional loyalism. But to select the issue of republicanism and constitutional loyalism and have a program for republic in one country is in fact is to make exactly the same error as the Corbynistas, that they imagine that you'd have a peaceful coexistence between the United States state and a Corbynista government. You would not have peaceful coexistence between the United States state and an English republic, any more than the British state, when it was the top dog, was prepared to have peaceful coexistence with a French republic. It wasn't. Yeah. I think that is in substance delusional. And back to what can we do? comrades who are stuck on the idea that it has to be organizations growing out of the class struggle, it has to be Soviets, etc., etc., are stuck on gerbils on a wheel, doing what the left has been doing for the past 60 years. I think 60 years will do. The Cliffites were doing that from the early 1960s. The IMG were doing that from the late 1960s, early 1970s, etc., 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 etc. So the flip side of this, the Lassallean and Eisenacher MPs play the role of exposing by intervening in the parliaments. The SDF and ILP councillors play the role of exposing by intervening in the councils, particularly the London County Council, which was there was a lot of political fights in, the nature of the actual capitalist regime and building up political support for the workers' organisations. That creates the conditions, if you're successful, where you build up the party as a state within a state, which promotes and supports and provides ideological backing for trade unions against the judiciary, cooperatives against the judiciary and the administrative state, festivals, workers' gun clubs, workers' sports clubs, blah, 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 all of this stuff. That's the nature of the SPD as it grows. It's the nature of the Italian Communist Party when it was at its height, and PCF when it was at its height. It's the nature of the Labour Party when it was in the processes of Europeanizing itself temporarily in the interwar period, which allowed it to become the party which became a government party in 1939-45. It's not saying that the upshot should be the same upshot, but that it's illusory to suppose that building that campaigning for councils of action works. It's just a repetition of the line of Luxembourg, and in fact it goes with it. Luxembourg and the councils of action stuff, it led Luxembourg and it led Daniel de Leon in the States. It leads to the construction of sects. It produces the construction of sects because it implies that the party has to do the job of the general staff of the revolution. And that in turn implies micromanagement. The other side of that, if we're going to have if we aren't going to have open polemic, we're going to have micromanagement. We have a choice between people being rude to each other in public and having micromanagement. So we can build a party of a sort which can create mass on a mass scale delegitimize the political regime. But we can only do so if we break with the illusions of the modern far left around Soviet power. That's it.
Thank you very much, comrades. There's been lots of activity in the chat while you were speaking, as I'm sure you can imagine. It strikes me that while this was a really interesting session looking at Lassalle and the Eisenachers and the Gotha unification, we went into a different direction there a little bit. Nevertheless, really interesting. Perhaps we could even pencil in a session on that question of collective decision making. It goes to the heart of course, what we're trying to build. And while councils might not be the answer, there's obviously been enough examples of the party deteriorating rather badly as well. So that's not necessarily just the answer itself either. So that seems to me a really interesting subject to look in some more detail. Thank you very much, everybody, for contributing. Thank you very much, Mike, for sparking a really interesting discussion and debate.